With nearly 30 titles revealed at the PlayStation 5 showcase last week, a lot has been shown and talked about, and in a wonderful turn, ray tracing was mentioned explicitly and demonstrated on PlayStation 5 hardware in multiple titles. In this video today, we'll be looking at the exact nature of ray tracing effects demonstrated in various games at the PlayStation 5 showcase. We'll look at how they appear to function and what we can perhaps expect for the future of titles on PlayStation 5. Real-time triangle ray tracing has only been in games in its current form for about 2 years, and building off that short span of open research, PlayStation 5 developers have demonstrated some incredible work having ray tracing in so many titles so quickly for this presentation. It must be stressed, ray tracing is still an incredibly new hardware and software paradigm, and we know of at least 6 titles on PlayStation 5 which look to utilize it so far. That's some good progress and deserves some respect given how computationally expensive and complex ray tracing can be. That's something that we learned rather quickly on PC 2 years ago with the RTX cards from Nvidia. A single full resolution ray tracing effect like reflections at 4K resolution on the biggest GPU available in the RTX 2080 Ti will drop frame rates by double-digit percentages. Other effects like ray trace direct shadows can be cheaper, but the cost is still very intense. So with less powerful GPUs like we see on the Xbox Series X or PlayStation 5 in comparison, we know developers will have to be cunning in their use of ray tracing to keep their resolution and frame rate reasonably high. So how have the developers done it in these short work in progress showings that we saw last week? Let's start off with Gran Turismo 7. Here the game is quite obviously using ray traced reflections for a number of the game's surfaces and on the car bodies themselves. A great example of this is on the body of this car here. While cube-mapped reflections of scenes can capture facsimiles of the environment at real time for many racing games like you see in Forza Horizon for example, they will technically be perspective incorrect and miss self-reflections. So here in Gran Turismo 7 we can see out-of-view reflections of the surroundings on the car body, as well as reflections of the car on the car itself. For a racing game, I think ray traced reflections have the huge benefit of making car materials much more realistic. Cars need reflections for off-screen elements and self-reflections so that metals and car paint and any shinier materials do not weirdly glow or look incorrect. Ray traced reflections greatly aid the type of materials that car games use. I especially like in the trailer how transparent materials like glass also get ray traced reflections as well, which is in itself more expensive than a reflection on an opaque surface usually. You also get cool things like the driver showing up in the rear view mirror, which I'm sure is a first for the series. Now we know that ray traced reflections as an effect are expensive from our experience on PC, so how are they getting it to work here? The first obvious optimization that caught my eye was the internal resolution of the ray traced reflections themselves. When you look at the reflections, the internal resolution becomes apparent. Here in this scene, if you look at the edges, you can see what I mean. You can see that a normal edge without a ray traced reflection on that edge has 1 width pixel edges, so 4K. Those edges though with the specular sheen that is coming from ray traced reflections have a pixel edge width that is 2 pixels wide, so a 4 pixel block is for 1 bit of detail, or 1080p. This means that for a coherent, stable edge like this one, we're looking at what appears to be quarter resolution ray traced reflections. So much like the ray traced reflections in Battlefield 5 when they're set to medium. A curious element that I saw as well is that moving edges within the reflections themselves have sawtooth lines in them, much like checkerboarding, which makes me wonder if we're actually looking at something that is lower than quarter resolution for reflections, so a checkerboarded or interlaced quarter resolution. In the end, this lower resolution can have some side effects for any highly specular edge, like the front of the car here, where the details on it look lower resolution than the rest of the scene. This is not the first time we would have seen a lower resolution and checkerboarding used for ray tracing, as Metro Exodus on PC's high option below Ultra for its ray traced global illumination was half resolution and then checkerboarded up to native resolution. This saved on performance and looked generally very similar to the full resolution version, but that was a rather diffuse effect. Quarter resolution being checkerboarded would be a pretty smart optimization and would go a long way to explaining how this game is targeting what appears to be a full resolution of 4K at 60 FPS. Another optimization that I think I'm seeing here in Gran Turismo is an optimization to get the best visual bang from a limited ray budget. Now in real life, unless an object is a perfect mirror, the reflection on that slightly rough surface will become more diffuse and have some darkening occurring based upon the camera angle of the reflection. This glossy reflection look requires more rays to be traced, as ray hits making up the soft part of the reflection have a greater incoherency, they have more randomness. So you need more rays to account for that, and the shading of that surface is more complex and expensive as well. One way to get around this, even with screen space reflections, is to not account for this behavior at all and to keep rays more coherent, so more like perfect mirror reflections. Then, as a post-process over this mirror-like reflection, you apply a downsample blur to various parts of the screen where different materials are found. This method of doing reflections is not physically accurate to materials, but it makes it so that different material types can more cheaply have reflections. This is, for example, how screen space reflections were done in any of the Decima engine games. And it can also be done for ray traced reflections, as was described by Morgan Maguire in the DDGI paper. If you look throughout the scenes with ray traced reflections here in Gran Turismo as shown on PlayStation 5, you will notice that the reflections along their entire length have the same level of sharpness. They do not change their level of sharpness within a single material type, just rather across different materials, which indicates to me that a similar optimization is being used here. Moving over to another title with ray traced reflections, we have Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart, which according to the game developers has at least ray traced reflections on Clank himself, which are great looking in this scene where you see Clank's own body reflected in the metal of his chin. Self-reflections just look awesome. And watching any of the footage though, it looks like there's ray traced reflections used on a number of the most shiny surfaces in the game, like the metallic floors across the gameplay demo area from the second part of the stream after the main trailer. Unfortunately, there is no high quality video for this part of the gameplay to look at the finer detail like we could in Gran Turismo. But even with this low quality video feed, there are some things to note. Much like in Gran Turismo, it appears that there's a uniform level of reflectivity across an entire surface. Another interesting thing that happens is that a number of objects look to be excluded from the ray traced reflections. Like the barrier here outside, where you can see behind the barrier in the reflection, and it's not there. Or here, you can see this railing thing in front of the circular door, which is also missing though from the reflection. I'm not sure if this is a bug or ways to save on performance by having less objects in the acceleration structure. Another thing I noticed was how debris from destroyed objects look to be missing from reflections. So here you can see the seat here on the floor. It has a reflection when it's static, but it loses its reflection the moment it moves and changes into debris. The reason why this optimization might be in this early footage is because the acceleration structure for moving objects or rapidly changing objects in ray tracing needs to be rebuilt in real time on the GPU and cannot be drawn from static memory really. And mind you, this is a separate cost on top of the cost from tracing the rays or shading them, and it can take many milliseconds of frame time in its own right for complex dynamic scenes. This BVH rebuilding, as it is called, makes moving objects like characters or destructible environments more expensive than static ones. As a contrast to these visible types of optimization, we have the game Stray by Blue 12, which is utilizing Unreal Engine 4. Unreal Engine 4 as an engine by default has very high quality ray traced reflections that are physically accurate, showing stretching, darkening, and all those physical aspects, but it tends to be pretty expensive in my testing, like I saw in Ghost Runner on PC. Here in the trailer you can see them in great detail, like in this scene here as the one barber robot and his customer are standing in front of the mirror. Nearly every single thing reflected in this mirror is off screen or obscured by some other object in the foreground. And since the mirror is not perfectly clean, the clarity of the reflection changes with the material surface and really looks excellent. And given what I know about Unreal Engine 4, this is probably not cheap. As we go outdoors here, we can see how great of an effect this varying level of roughness and the physically accurate materials can have with that reflection stretching and all those cool things. It looks really great. You can see in this trailer also how ray traced reflections are found on the glass canopy of the tuk-tuk here. Reflections though are the only obvious thing. This scene may technically have ray tracing effects like ray trace shadows and the like, but due to it being a trailer, and since Unreal Engine 4 can have very high resolution baked lighting, with all the memory that PlayStation 5 has, I cannot claim that there are other less obvious types of ray tracing going on here. That uncertainty is something that applies to other games, like the Blue Point remake of Demon's Souls, where according to the PlayStation blog, it has ray tracing for shadows. But I'm not sure if they mean indirect shadows or direct shadows, and no shots in the trailer give hints to any of those in an obvious way. But a usage of ray tracing that I thought was obvious is actually the most interesting usage of ray tracing in the PlayStation 5 reveal, and that is Capcom's Pragmata on the RE engine, which has powered some incredible looking games this generation. Here there are two visible types of ray tracing in play, the first of which is ray traced reflections. In the shortcut trailer from the conference, these ray traced reflections are really obvious in the child's eye in this scene, where you can see the billboards of the buildings the child is looking at changing in real time in the ray traced reflections. And if you look close enough, you can see how the child's eyelashes and the child's face are reflected in a distorted manner in the eye. Ray traced reflections are amazing for this reason, as they offer infinitely accurate detail and self-reflections no matter how close the camera gets. The interesting thing about these reflections is that they function a lot like those found in Battlefield 5. In Battlefield 5, SSR is mixed in with ray traced reflections for those areas where ray traced reflections and screen space reflections would return the exact same result. And if you turn the reflections to low or medium ray tracing in Battlefield 5, the game increases the roughness cutoff for reflections to save performance, so only the shiniest things like puddles on the ground will get ray traced reflections. This is exactly what Pragmata does in this trailer, where ultra sharp and cheaper reflections in the character's eyes or ultra sharp reflections from puddles on the ground are done with ray tracing. But the rougher reflections on the street, for example, are done mostly through SSR. So you can see such reflections disappearing in and out of existence when they're obscured, like underneath the child's hair in this scene, where you can see this line in the reflection where it is dark when the child moves her head. It's a very smart optimization that I find fascinating. The second ray tracing effect in this trailer is even more interesting, and that would be some form of ray trace global illumination. It is most obvious when the astronaut-looking character walks in front of the yellow taxi. As they walk in front of it, the yellow from the bounced lighting hitting the taxi illuminates the left side of their suit, and as they lift their hand, you can even see an indirect shadow in that bounced light from their arm going across the astronaut's chest. This is really an amazing level of lighting detail. The effect is most visible here in this scene, but it looks to be applied across the entire trailer, and explains really well how this trailer actually looks good. This trailer is set primarily in the shadows, and traditional non-ray traced lighting for dynamic objects and shadows tends to fail very obviously. One side effect that this ray trace global illumination has at the moment though is visible if you look at the much less compressed footage that Capcom released on their own YouTube channel. This footage is 4K 60 FPS and mentions the Xbox Series X and PC versions of this game, so I'm not actually sure which platform this footage is from. But if you watch the footage, you will notice how this indirect lighting on the characters is especially grainy. It's as if the light is made up of tiny stippled points. This is generally how real-time ray tracing looks when it is not aggressively denoised. I'm of course not sure how the final product of Pragmata will look and run when it comes out in 2022, but this is the most impressive utilization of ray tracing seen at the PlayStation 5 event as I see it. And perhaps it points to the level of ray tracing we might see in the future a few years down the line. It utilizes a smart optimization to keep ray traced reflections more reasonable in performance, and has enough rendering juice left over for game-changing real-time global illumination. We'll have to wait and see how it looks when it comes out. In the meantime, if you did enjoy this video, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, then consider hitting that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. If you want to see more content like this in the future and help us out, support Digital Foundry on Patreon to get years worth of Digital Foundry content available in high quality for download. If you want to talk to me about ray tracing and such, write a comment below and follow me and Digital Foundry on Twitter. And as always, this is Alex, bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen!